secret plan of printing, right? And so that's how the secret got out. But for Rusty, he went to the museum in Germany, the Gutenberg Museum. He saw the printing press that was there, and he said, it's a good looking press, but it doesn't represent what he would have started with. That had to be a much later iteration because it's a beautiful piece of furniture, right? And so he started looking trying to reverse engineer it, going backwards. What would Gutenberg have started with? Printing was already happening, right? They had woodcut printing. So most everything was manuscript, manually scribed, right? That was very expensive. But they were doing some printing that was woodcut printing. You would carve it in a block of wood, and then you would ink it, and you'd print that on the paper. And then when it's dry, they would come back and they would handwrite in the text or paint in the pictures and so forth. So it was still very cumbersome. And if you wanted the next page of the book, you had to carve a new woodcut to print the next page. So it was very cumbersome. So Gutenberg's idea of the movable type was applying that to the printing that was happening. Rusty realized that what was available to Gutenberg for a printing press was a wine press. The wine presses were readily available in southern Germany, northern France. That was all wine region. So it would have been easy for him to go out to the wineries and buy a press and make some simple changes to it and make it a printing press. We know that Johann Gutenberg ordered one press to be built as a wine press. So that helps us again. So this is modeled after a 15th century wine press is where this model comes from. It's been very well received. We've built these for museums all over the world now. And this one just happens to be ours. So, all right. So tonight we were going to talk about the Reformation, and we can definitely talk about the Reformation if you all would like. But it was also maybe suggested maybe talking about some other topics of things. And so I was going to suggest maybe, did anybody read the banners out front, those graphics out front? There's one with the picture of the couple on that. Did anybody read that one? Did you read it? Was there any question bubbling around in there after you read it? Oh man, I tried to phrase it so it would prompt questions, but nobody ever asked me the questions, right? So there was 4 items that came into the exhibit that were confirmation to Rusty and Tisha that they would continue this ministry. So a little bit of background on them. Rusty and Tisha were high school sweethearts back in the day, and life separated them after high school, and they ended up meeting together again 35, 40 years later, and they got married. They were both of Jewish background. Rusty was a character. Okay, sorry, I got to tell you a little bit of Rusty's story. Tisha's an interesting story. Her family were gamblers and ran home casinos. And so they kept moving all the time. As soon as the heat was on that they were going to get busted, they'd move to another city. So that was her life. That was chaotic. Rusty, his father was a drummer for, doggone it, I always forget the name of the band. It was the big band back in the 40s, real popular big band. They were playing for all the troops and everything, and it was somebody's name. I can't ever remember his name. But anyways, the big band era. And so Rusty's father was the drummer for that band. Was it? Oh, okay. All right. That's right on the tip of my tongue. I can't think of it. Anyways, Rusty's father was a drummer for that band. His mother was a little girl from Texas that traveled to New York for whatever reason, meets this guy that's a drummer. They get married, and she marries a Jewish guy. Well, his mother's parents in Texas were very, 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 very wealthy and very powerful people. And When the daughter didn't come home and was having kids in New York with this Jewish guy, this Texas businessman was very angry. And so he was connected with everybody, the governors, everybody of power in Texas, the sheriffs, the rangers, all these things were all his friends. He sent some people to New York and they kidnapped Rusty, his brother, and his sister and brought them back to Texas. And when they got back to Texas, Rusty had the curls and, they were very orthodox. And he was the older one. He was like 6, 7 years old. And so they cut off all their hair and got rid of their clothes and gave them blue jeans and button downs and cowboy boots and said, "You're Baptist now." And so raised him in the Baptist church. When Rusty was a teenager, he started working for his grandfather. His grandfather was one of the founders of Geico Insurance. And so Rusty was working at their print shop, printing all their pamphlets and things. And he told his grandfather, he says, I've been doing this for so many years, I'd like a raise. And his grandfather, I guess he was kind of a snarky old guy. He says, "Oh, I'd pay you what you're worth, but the minimum wage says I have to pay you more, and joking with him. But he gave Rusty beautiful cars. At this point, he's got one of those Mercedes with the gull wing Mercedes, right? 17-year-old kid driving one of those, right? And the old man tells him, he says, "If you make more money, you're only going to get in trouble. I give you a beautiful car, I give you a beautiful home, you have all the food you need, and you have money to spend. You don't need any more money, you're only going to get in trouble." So Rusty thinks he has it all worked out, and he quits his grandfather to go work for another company. His grandfather tells him, if you do that, it's not going to work out for you. Okay, Rusty was he was also into judo, and that had just become a competitive sport in the Olympics, and he was the second in line to go to the Olympics. The first in line took him out and hurt him real bad, so he had a plate in his collarbone. Well, that made him 4F'd for the draft, right? So he wouldn't be drafted. Rusty quit his grandfather's work, went to work for the other company, and by the end of the week, he had a draft notice in the mail that he was 1A. And his grandfather had gone to his friend at the draft board and changed his status, and Rusty was being drafted. So Rusty rolled with it. Now, I'm just telling you a few of these things so you get a picture of this guy's background, right? He goes to Vietnam. He's been trained. He went in as a corpsman with the Navy. He goes to with the Marines. They go to Vietnam, and on their first mission, everybody's wiped out, but him and the chief are the only two survivors. And being the medic, he's covered in blood, and they figure he's got to be wounded, so they fly him out to the hospital ship. He gets out there, there's no injuries. So they cycle him back to Da Nang at the harbor there, and he has to wait for reassignment to another unit. And while he's waiting, they're looking for someone to do MP duty, shore patrol in the city there. And he volunteers, and you're not supposed to have medics as shore patrol, but they let him do it because they're desperate, so they let him do it. And after that night shift, he's walking back to the base. It's wee hours of the morning, and he hits a tripwire. Somebody set up a mine to take out the Americans near the base, but they had the charge face the wrong way. And so it blew up the tree instead of towards him, which would obviously killed him. So it knocked the tree down on him. And so he has two brushes with death. And at this point, he's decided he's an atheist. He's denying God. And somehow a friend of his, I don't quite know this part of the story, that he had gone to church with as a kid, is a chaplain with the Army, and hears that Rusty is down at the Navy base. So he drives all the way across Vietnam and takes Rusty a Bible to read. And Rusty says, "Oh, thank you," and throws it in his bunk and lets it go at that. Fast forward a few more years, he's back in Texas. God gets a hold of him. He says, "God, if you're real, I'm tired of living this life. Make yourself real to me." He sees that little Bible over there in a box, gets it, reads it, and gives his life back to Christ. He begins to work in a business. He owns a business. He's doing really well. And he buys, oh, it's out front out there. There's a manuscript page of an Ethiopic Bible. And that Ethiopic Bible was the first page for the museum. And he bought that for his office. And a guy comes into his office and sees that on the wall. He's there to buy janitorial supplies, and this guy walks up to it and he looks at it and he reads it and he says, "Oh, that's the 23rd Psalms." Rusty says, how do you know that? How do you read that? And he says, "Oh, when I went to seminary, I learned to read uh, uh, what would be kind of an ancient type of Ethiopic." So that started a conversation. Rusty starts buying more Bibles and so forth, and he's encouraged to share them. He does that. It starts to develop into this museum. He's just doing it on the side. People say, "Hey, will you bring these things out and show them and tell people about it?" So he does that. It's become kind of a full-time deal, and they don't have the money to continue to do this. He gets an invitation to teach in Israel, and he goes over there to Hebrew University. And while he's at Hebrew University, just before they leave, he and his wife are praying, and they're saying, "We don't have the money to pay our electric bill here. We're just done with this whole trying to do a museum thing. We're done. We're going to go to Israel when we get back. We're going to start a business again." And God impresses upon Tisha's heart she always journaled her prayers, and so the Lord told her that they would receive 4 items to confirm that they were going to stay in the ministry. That's what this whole thing's developing to. Rusty's in his office, and he's praying, and of course the Lord puts it on his heart as well. When they get together and they're talking about this, Tisha shows him the list and says, "These are the 4 items that the Lord said we're going to have come into the museum." Rusty says, "If we had $1 million, we couldn't just buy these things. They just don't come for sale. One of these pieces, one hasn't come for sale for more than 20 years. They're not out there." And so Tisha told him, he says, we're not going to buy these. That's not what he said. He says they're going to come into the exhibit. And so in the next 18 months, less than that, is about 14 months, all 4 of those pieces came into the exhibit. And he came out with $10,000 in cash on top of those 4 pieces coming in. So let me tell you about the 4 pieces. Rusty went to Israel to teach, and they were there for several months. And when they came home from that teaching, when they got to their house, there was a box on the porch that had been sitting there for weeks. And when they opened up the box, inside was that Bible over here, that first edition King James Bible. So Rusty called the man that shipped it, and he says, "What in the world are you doing? I've been out of the country, and you send this, and it's just sitting on my porch for weeks, and it's rained on it and everything else, and thankfully it's wrapped in plastic, And the man says, "Well, I didn't know you were out of the country." And he says, "I thought you would need that for the museum." And he said, that Bible there it's a He Bible, which is a typo in the early editions of the printing of the 1611. That makes it special as well. But that one is also, we're able to identify it as one of the first 50 printed in 1611. And there's, I think, 42 of those still known to exist, right around 40. And so the guy that sent this, he tells Rusty, he says, "Well, I've got 9 of these." He's an antiquities broker. He says, "I've got 9 of these, and no man should have 9 of these. You're doing an important ministry, so I sent it to you. And it's yours for as long as you're doing the ministry." So there's one item. Rusty went to New York to visit family, and while he was there, one of his cousins is a scribe at a scriptorium. And in the conversations, Rusty was telling him about what he does with all of this. And he said his cousin was really kind of rude, because now Rusty that he knew as a boy is Rusty, a Christian, and he's not a Jew anymore. And "What are you doing?" And so he said he was really kind of rude to him. And then all of a sudden he picked up this scroll that's back there, the ones with the handles on it, and said, "Here, take this. I don't know, just take this and get out of here." and that was one of the items, was to have a Hebrew scroll of antiquity. And the third one was the Gutenberg page. Rusty had in this ministry, we sell rare Bibles and Bible leaves to collectors and things, and that helps us with funding for what we do. And so people had asked him, we want a Gutenberg page. If you can find a Gutenberg page, we want one. And so a lady came up and she had 3 pages for sale. And Rusty was able to work it out where he was able to buy all 3, sell 2, keep 1, and had $10,000 left over out of the deal. And so now he has the Gutenberg page. And then the last one is the Wycliffe page. If you saw that out there, that Wycliffe page is just crazy rare. As I understand it, that's one of only 17 known to be in private ownership. After Wycliffe had died, they put him on trial for heresy, and once he was convicted, they went back and they destroyed everything that he had touched. They tried to erase him from history. So there's very little of his work out there. And so we have that page. Rusty saw the page coming for sale at an auction down in Houston. And so he was going to go down there, and he took his father's Rolex watch and pawned it. And he pawned a couple of the other Bibles that we have, not that one, but a couple of the others. He took a second on his house and got cash out on his house. He gathered everything he could to go down there, and he went down to Houston, and the page was going for auction, and he got outbid, and somebody else bought it. And he said he drove home, and he said he was literally crying so hard he had to pull over. He couldn't understand, after all these decades, a page finally came for sale, and it was obviously intended for him, but he wasn't able to buy it. What the heck, God? What kind of game you playing here, right? And what an incredible lesson in God's timing, right? So he goes home, he gets his stuff out of pawn and all these things again. And it's some time later he went to it's called the International Society of Bible International Society of Bible Collectors, ISBC. And he was at their convention, and it sounds like a huge organization. There's like 20 guys there. And he goes there, and they're talking, and this guy named Joe Johnson comes up to him and says, hey, you were at the auction, to bid on that. Or I saw you at the auction in Houston. And Rusty says, yeah, I was there. I was bidding on the Wycliffe page, but I was outbid. I didn't get it. I don't understand. And Joe told him, he says, well, I'm the one that bought that, and I'm not supposed to have it. And he took it out of his coat and handed it to Rusty and said, you're supposed to have this. And so that was the 4th item. So all those pieces came in, and Rusty never questioned once anymore if he was supposed to be in the museum business. Huh? You got it for nothing? Yeah. And, right? And that's, sometimes we get out ahead of the Father and we don't let him do his work, right? And, okay, God, I got it from here, nope. Stay in his path. So since I've been doing this, that happened a couple of years before I came along. Well, it was about 8 years before I came along. And since I've been in this, the Lord has done that several more times with other things. That there's a Bible out in the case out there that's called the Pearl Bible, if you saw that. It's the first Bible printed in English for soldiers. It was Oliver Cromwell with the British Civil War. And he printed those Bibles in English for his soldiers because he said, my soldiers have to be godly men to be able to do this, right? And so that came up for auction, and I had never seen one go for auction before. And I had been asked to put together a soldier's Bibles collection. And I enjoyed that. I'm retired Air Force myself, and I'm like, heck yeah, that'd be an awesome thing. I'll do that. And so this came up for auction, and I called Rusty, and I said, hey, the opening bid is just under $700. And I said, I can put together about $2,000, maybe $2,500, about all I can come up with. And Rusty says, oh, I think I can do about the same. Count me in for the same. So I was like, okay, we got $5,000. It's hardly a drop in the bucket for what we're going to try to bid on, So I put my bid in. Nobody bid against me. I got it for the opening bid. I think it was like $680 or something, And we've been offered a lot for it since then. A lot of people are like, I've never seen one before, There's a scroll out there, the newest scroll we have. It was a man that was a supporter of the ministry, and he says, and I had been asking Rusty, I said, we need to buy another scroll for a second exhibit we were putting together. I said, I need a scroll for that second exhibit. And he says, okay. So this guy calls, and he had some property in Israel by the Galilee, and he had to pay property taxes on it, and he was hurting for money. And he says, can you guys just loan against it for me? And I told him, I said, no, I don't want to do that. If you want to sell it, I'll buy it, but I don't want to loan against it. I'm not a pawn, And so he hemmed and hawed, and he finally said, okay. And he sold it to me for a couple $1,000s. And that was exactly what we needed at that time. But then there's been other things that I'm like, oh, wouldn't that be awesome in the exhibit? And I bid on it. Far out of reach. Okay, that one wasn't for me, So it's been really amazing to see God's hand on this all the way through. I'll just tell you just a little bit more. So I'm retired Air Force. That pays all my bills at home. When I go out and I do this, the Father takes care of us while we're out on the road. I was coming back from, I think we were in Nebraska. We kind of made a loop up into Nebraska, and we're going back down to Texas. And it was on Election Day in 2016. I remember that because we'd already voted, but we were driving back, and I had resigned myself to who was going to be president and all that, and basically blew up the engine on the truck. And we were in Kansas. Where were we? Wichita, Kansas, right by McConnell Air Force Base. And I had it towed to a mechanic. The mechanic gives me an estimate of about $6,800 or something to fix the truck. And I'm like, man, I don't know what we're going to do with this, and we were praying about it. And one of the donors, Rusty was talking to him on the phone, and he says, tell John to, don't worry, I'll take care of that bill for him, And I never knew who he was. They just took care of it and got us back on the road. So only one time, praise Yah, that I went out, we didn't have the gas to get back, right? And it's like, well, we have these appointments we have to go to, and he'll figure out a way for us. And this was probably about 7 or 8 years ago. And it's like, okay, here we go. I got enough to get there. And so we started our trip working north to our stops. And of course, he filled in all the gaps for us and fuel in the tank, and we're back home. And the Father always meets us right where we're at every time we're doing something. Well, last year I was in Florida, and I had a hydraulic line on the trailer broke. The hydraulics put the slide outs in and raised the feet. And it was in the front of the trailer, there's the generator there, right? And the hose was on top of that firebox of the generator, and you just can't get around it. And it's sealed in there, but the hose is above that. So I was over the church we were teaching at, and I was talking to this guy, and he was from Maine. He was a lobster fisherman from Maine. And so I was talking to him about it. I'm like, I don't know what to do. I can't figure out how to get in there. And he goes, well, let me look at it. I work on my boat and stuff. I'll figure it out. And he went over there. He was just a little bitty guy, a little skinny guy. And he's like, I can get in there. And he takes the propane tanks out, and he climbs up in where the propane tanks were. And he got up on top of that firebox and took the hose out, and we replaced it. It's like, I could have never gotten my slim self in there, But he just meets us every time where we're at. And I truly believe this is the mission he has for us. So, um, okay, why don't we go ahead? Let's talk a bit about the Reformation. The Reformation was, oh, I don't want to move that. I need to stay there for the camera. I mentioned earlier that so many of these historical pieces that come together, um, you can almost envision the giant chessboard of God, of Yah moving the pieces on the chessboard, right? And the Reformation was his next big play. But it couldn't have started without the invention of movable type and the printing press. This had to happen. Gutenberg was not the first to invent movable type. There was a Chinese inventor about 800 years, 700 years earlier. But he had over 3,500 characters, so it was very impractical, and he made his pieces out of porcelain. There was a Korean inventor about 300 years later that had invented movable type, but he had over 1,400 characters, and they were out of porcelain. Again, not very practical. Gutenberg stumbles on the idea of movable type, and he has 22 Latin letters to deal with, and he comes from a family of metal workers, and he makes his out of lead. And so they're quick to be, you can cast them quickly, you can print your pages, you can melt them down. It was a very efficient system. And Gutenberg tried his best to keep it secret. Through a lawsuit, he had to disclose what he was doing in open court. And the public found out what he was doing. And part of that public was the scribes that would handwrite everything out, found out about Gutenberg's going to print things and put them out of business. And so they burned his shop down. They got together and they burned his shop down and ran him out of town. So he had to start again. He started again in the business. But in that time, other people grabbed the idea and started creating print shops. There's a banner out front that in that 50-year period from 1450 to 1500 is called Out of the Cradle in Cunilabila. And in that 50-year period, just in the Netherlands, they had over 1,000 printing presses working and had produced over 8 million books, primarily Bibles. Think about what's happening in the rest of Europe. The printing presses are going crazy, books are being produced, and they're primarily the Bibles that are being produced. The Bibles that are being produced at this point are Latin Vulgate, right? This sets the stage for the coming Reformation. Down here on the end is Erasmus. Erasmus and his older brother, his older brother were the illegitimate sons of a priest and the daughter of a physician. And that was going to be the man that God was going to use to do big work, right? And it's always an amazing thing. I heard a song this morning as I was sitting here doing a little studying, and I forget how it said it exactly, but something to the effect of, isn't it always the imperfect that Yah uses, right? The people with the blemishes, that don't have the track record or the pedigree to do it, and he uses them, right? So here's a man that's the illegitimate son of a priest. He should be low man in society, and would be his grandfather, the physician, sends him to schools at an Augustine monastery, and while he's there, he falls in love with Greek. And he has a life's mission of collecting every early Greek manuscript that he can get his hands on. And he does it's called a duoglot. It's a Greek-Latin translation of the Bible. So now remember, to this point, they've had the Roman Catholic Church has had the Latin Vulgate, okay? Erasmus asked permission to do this new translation of the Bible from Greek to Latin, and he's told, no, don't do that. And he does it anyways. And at the end of this, when it's finally ready to publish, he dedicates it to the Pope and basically says, here, Dad, this is for you. And the Pope says, oh, well done, son, and blesses it, and off they go. That new Greek Latin side by side was going to be the spark that sets off the Reformation now. When Martin Luther sees that for the first time and he begins to study, so many of his questions are being answered, right? He's seeing that some of these practices that we're doing within the church are not biblical. And the church is neglecting to teach the beauty of grace. And he has been operating under this premise of, if he forgets one thing, one slight on someone, and he hasn't confessed it to a priest, he's going to get sent to purgatory. But that isn't what Messiah set up for us, right? And so he's seeing these things, and this has got the gears grinding, and this is over a long process. Obviously, I'm condensing this down. He writes his 95 Theses. That was a common practice at the university, that students and professors would write out questions, ideas, they would nail them to the door. Anybody then could read those questions, and if they were interested in that, they would come down for the Saturday and hear the debate on those topics. So Martin Luther writes out his 95 Theses, nails it to the door. Somebody takes it down and takes it to a print shop, and they make copies of it and distribute it all around the countryside. And so instead of just a few professors and the students coming to hear this debate, now the whole countryside has shown up to hear it. It gets out of control very quickly for Martin Luther. He has to answer for why he's saying these things. They try to get him to back down. And he takes the stand that, if basically you leadership, if you can show me where I'm wrong in Scripture, I'll back down. Otherwise, his quote is, "Here I stand," right? And so there he stood. When he leaves the trial, he's heading home, and a friend kidnaps him and hides him away in a castle under an assumed name. And there he does his translation of the Bible into German. He has the protection of that prince to watch over him and make sure he's safe. So he has the luxury of saying, "I'm not going to release this until it's complete, and then I'll release it to the people." William Tyndale comes along just shortly after Martin Luther is getting started. He knows the hubbub that Martin Luther has caused. God calls Martin Luther to translate the Bible into English. English is the poor people's language. Anybody that speaks English, you speak English because you're uneducated. If you had any kind of education or upbringing, you would have spoke Latin or French. So there's no real written form for English at this time. William Tyndale asked permission to translate the Bible into English, and he's told, "No, you can't do that." And he does it anyways. But what he does is he takes sabbatical time from the university he's teaching at, and he goes, he takes a position as a family priest at a country estate. And so while he's out there in the country, he's working on his translation, and he's working on that. Well, the leadership finds out what he's doing, and they have him arrested and brought to the bishop's house to answer for why he's doing this. And they really hope to be able to talk him into stopping and just going back to work. The dinner doesn't go well. He loses William Tyndale loses his temper at the dinner, and he has to run for his life. He leaves England, his home, and he disappears into mainland Europe. And while he's in Europe, William Tyndale spoke 10 languages. 6 of them, they said he was so good that people that it was their native language thought it was his native language, right? So when he goes to mainland Europe and he hits those other countries, he just disappears into the fabrics of society. They can't find him, right? They're looking for this big, tall Englishman, and instead he's become a German or he's become a Frenchman or whatever, because he just blends in. He's got people hiding him. Every time he finishes a book of the Bible, he leaves it with the printer and moves to another location. And the printer is printing those, and they're smuggling them into England. So the people are getting the Bible in their own language for the first time. King Henry VIII is the king at this time. King Henry VIII is having problems with the Pope. He's petitioned the Pope for a divorce. He wants to divorce his wife Catherine and marry a new girl because Catherine hasn't given him a son. The Pope told him, no, you can't get a divorce for that. And so Henry VIII really goes dirty and just is absolutely scandalous, the things he's saying about his wife of, I think at this point they've been married 16 years or something. And she was originally married to his older brother, and his older brother was killed. And so then Henry marries her. And Henry started accusing her of, you had consummated the marriage with my brother, and that makes our marriage illegitimate. And so she, of course, swore that never happened. And after all these years, what are you doing, They had a daughter together, Mary. Eventually, while this is happening, Henry hears the drama of William Tyndale being pursued by the Catholic Church. So Henry thinks the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so he begins to send overtures to William Tyndale. Hey, come back to England. I'll protect you from the Pope. You take my side in these issues and we'll be good together. And William Tyndale says, no, thank you. I'm not subject to the Pope, and I'm not subject to the King, right? I'm doing this translation for the Father. So there's no love there now. Eventually, so the church has been sending out bounty hunters to catch William Tyndale, to get him stopped. And they can't find him. Eventually, the bounty gets so high for him that a friend sells him out and takes the reward. And so they arrest William Tyndale, and they end up burning him at the stake. There's a picture of it down here from Fox's Book of Martyrs. When they have him tied to the stake, they put a rope around his neck, and his last words are, Lord, open the King of England's eyes. And he's praying to the Bible, for the Bible in English is what he's praying for. After Tyndale is killed, he's burned there at the stake. They do strangle him first, by the way, and then they burn his body. Just months after this, Henry gets his divorce, and he marries the new girl, Anne Boleyn. And we believe that Anne Boleyn likely had a Bible in English that she brought to the marriage. Henry sees it and says, oh, this is great. This is exactly what I need for my new church. And he commands that the Bible in English be printed for the churches and made available to the people. So William's prayer is answered. The Bible in English is there. Okay. Henry eventually has a son, Edward. And Henry dies. Edward's 9 years old. He becomes king at 9. He only lives to be 14. And in those years, he continues his father's desire of expanding the Protestant church, the Protestant movement, right? As he realizes he's dying as a kid, he organizes the support to have basically his nanny become queen, a lady named Jane Grey, Lady Jane Grey, strangely enough. And so Edward dies. When Mary hears that Edward is dying, she begins a campaign of, I have the right to be the queen. I will be ascending to the throne, not Lady Jane Grey. So right after Edward dies, Lady Jane Grey is queen for about 10 days, and then Mary comes in. And I'm sure the conversation went something like, how long do you want to live? Because I'm going to be queen and you're not. And so she quickly capitulates and gives Mary the throne. When Mary comes in, the first thing she does is have the divorce decree annulled. So that gives her the right back to being queen. She becomes queen. She disbands the Anglican Church and brings Catholicism back. All those Protestants that had been involved in the Anglican Church run for their lives. She catches a guy named John Rogers, who was William Tyndale's editor. And when they capture him, they burn him at the stake in front of his family. They make the wife and children watch. And they say they kept him alive for 4 to 4.5 hours in the fire, and before he finally died. Another guy was Cranmer. He was the one that signed the divorce decree. He got burned. Now, the pendulum has swung the other way. The Catholics that felt like they were being abused are going to return the favor and abuse the Protestants. And so there's a lot of anger that comes out. In my view, Mary never instructed anyone to kill anybody over the Bibles in English. That was zealots that just took that on and did that. It was very easy for the church officials to go to the one printer in England that has the license to print the Bible and say, who bought Bibles? Brits are really good at keeping records. And so they were able to go and find who had the Bibles. They would go out to those houses and they would collect the Bibles. If they were given up, they would burn them. If they weren't given up, they would search the house and take the Bibles. And sometimes they would punish the families. They would beat the families, or they would kill the families for having the Bible in English. So this page that's down here is from a Martyr's Bible. It was a 1540 Bible printed in English, and some family got caught with that Bible. And what they would do is they would kill the whole family over the Bible, bleed them over the pages of the Bible, and then they would take the Bible out in the street and they would tear the pages out, and they'd say, this is what happens if you have these heretical Bibles, turn them in. What they didn't expect was the neighbors come out and gather the pages up and wash them and sew them back together, and now they have a Bible that's in English that's unaccounted for. The Protestants that could get away from Geneva, Switzerland did, and many of them ended up in, many of the Protestants getting away from England did and gathered in Geneva, Switzerland. And in Geneva, they were able to produce another English Bible that became known as the Geneva Bible. So on this panel over here, the small page all the way to your left is the first New Testament with Bible verses by William Whittingham. And then just to the right of that is a page from the 1560 Geneva Bible that is the first Bible with Bible verses in the Old and the New Testament. It also has commentary notes in the margins. It's the first study Bible. So you pick it up and you read it, and then you could read in the margins and get some idea of what is being talked about and how that applies. The problem with it is those notes were not, they were not friendly to the Catholic Church, right? These are by John Calvin. John Calvin hated the Catholics hated John Calvin. He produces this Bible. The notes are some are just downright nasty towards the Catholic faith. And so it was very inflammatory. Let me see here. I'm just going to grab a little drink here. So now we're speeding along to the King James Bible. There are some other steps in here. After the Geneva Bible, once Mary was off of the scene, was Elizabeth, her half-sister, became queen. When Elizabeth becomes queen, she brings the Anglican Church back, but allows Anglican and Catholicism to live together. And I always pictured Elizabeth as a sweet little old queen, and she wasn't. She was a hard-nosed, tough lady that put on a soft persona, but she was all business. Basically, you had two choices. You could be Catholic or you could be Anglican, and there wasn't any gray area in between. The Puritans were growing in popularity during this time, and they were allowed to exist because they fairly quickly got some political power. They started being elected to the House, to the lower house in England. And they were trying to exercise that political clout to have more freedom in England. When Elizabeth dies and King James comes on the scene, some of the Puritans make a quick dash north to try to catch King James as he's coming down from Scotland and intercept him with this, hey, great news, you're going to be king, and you come from the Presbyterian nation of Scotland, and hey, you're kind of cousin to us being the Puritan groups. Are you going to be there to help us? And they didn't realize that he was very anti-Presbyterian and very he was just not a very religious guy. He really had no use for church and so forth. He really pushed back hard on them, and he didn't appreciate that intercept that happened. When he gets down to London, they hold a big conference for 2 weeks. Everybody's invited to discuss the issues within the churches, the Anglican Church and the Protestant Church, the Church of England. But the Puritans were not invited. And they were supposed to have been invited, but they weren't. They didn't come in for several days later when most of the decisions had been made. He, as a very kind of backhand, almost an afterthought of that meeting, allowed for a new translation of the Bible. It was very low on the priority list. It was so low on the priority list, when he commissioned the Bible to be translated, he didn't put any money towards the project. He just told the professors, the linguists of the biblical languages, right, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, from the universities, you just have to do it. Do it in your spare time. Do it wherever you find it. Get it done. So he commissioned 60 of the best scholars to go back with William Tyndale's translation of the Bible and compare it to the biblical languages and make any corrections that needed to be made. And of course, get rid of those margin notes. No margin notes, right? You can have cross references and restore back into the King James Bible the position that the king, the royals, have authority over the church, right? Which is kind of a stretch on the biblical side of things, right? But he wanted that restored. So they work through the scriptures. They break into small teams, and they take one book of the Bible at a time. So the Greek, maybe starting with the Gospel of John, and the Hebrew starts with, whatever, and the Aramaic group starts with whatever. And they work through that as teams. Once they get through that book of the Bible, then they get together with the larger team and they review it all again, and they take any of those. So when they had a word and they wanted to correct it, they'd write it in the margin. And so they were instructed that they would work together as a team and resolve those issues and get the columns or the margins cleared out as much as possible. So I'll point out on this Bible here, it's open to Psalms 1:1. It says, "Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly." And ungodly is bracketed, and in the margin is wicked. And those are synonyms without a difference to me, right? Wicked and ungodly. But to the translators, there was enough of a difference that they wanted that there to add depth for the reader. It really helped me appreciate how hard the translators had worked on the King James Bible. And I'll tell you, to me, it's absolute poetry. It's beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Where William Tyndale, working under very harsh conditions, they're hunting him and wanting to kill him, he often used maybe the same words, right? And when these men had the time to add clarification, they could find another word that fit a little bit better, translating-wise. One of the challenges is we don't have enough words in the English language to clearly translate across from Hebrew into English. It's not just a one for one. These words didn't exist, and to some degree, they still don't do it justice, right? So over here on the William Tyndale page, you'll see there's a list of words and phrases first penned by William Tyndale, right? Those had never been written in English before, right? We look at that, and there's words like mercy seat and showbread, scapegoat. Those were words that didn't exist in our lexicon, right? So we created words to fill those gaps to help this process. That freaks some people out. What do you mean he created words, right? Well, we create words all the time to describe things that we have, cell phones and cars or whatever other things we invent, right? So that's not an uncommon practice. But we have another 90 years of scholarship by the time we get over to here. With the King James Bible, this one here has a couple of interesting quirks to it. I think I mentioned earlier, we can identify that this is one of the first 50 printed. And that's one of the reasons why it's open to the book of Psalms. I'm going to kind of poke my head over the edge here. If you look, those vertical lines on the sides where you have the margin notes, on the right-hand side of that page towards the bottom, about the 50th Bible, somebody dropped a tool or something on there and scuffed those lines, those vertical lines. So all of the other ones going forward from there all had little gaps on those lines. So this one does not have those marks, and that's one of the indicators this one is in the first 50. In the book of Ruth, this is called a He Bible. In the book of Ruth 3:15, it says, and he went into the city, and it should have been she, right? So these became known as He Bibles. When they corrected it, they became known as She Bibles. It's an amazing thing to me when oftentimes when we're talking to people about the accuracy of transmission and so forth, people don't appreciate how important it was to these men to have it accurate. It's hard to get our heads around when we have television and radio and all these distractions in the world, and we don't fully understand the purity of what's in front of us and how important that is. And, here in this whole big giant Bible, we have one letter missing, and they were able to catch that in the first printing and correct it by the second run, right? And I just think about that myself. I have a Bible in front of me and I'm reading it. My brain will either fill in the missing letter or I'll just read through it and not even pick up the change of gender. You know what I mean? And I would say that we can see that through going all the way back to the Hebrew Scrolls, the passion to have it accurate, the counting the letters and all these different procedures to make sure this is accurate and correct before I move on. And I'll stress this, I know we're not talking about the scrolls in a minute, but I should have said this at the time. When the scribes or a rabbi is reading from the scroll, it's his responsibility as part of that maintenance to make sure every letter is legible, it's clear, it's properly shaped, it's not touching another letter, it's always independent, all of these things. So that's part of that maintaining process. In the Hebrew culture, they've been reading through these scrolls since they were little ones, all the way up, and you read through them every year. So if you're sitting down with a scroll to read ahead for your group, and you see something that's wrong, it's going to jump out at you, right? He'll correct that before it moves on. And it's just, it's wonderful, the checks and balances that the Father gave us for His Word to come to us today, and we know that it's true and it's accurate as we have it in our hands. If you weren't here earlier, one of my favorite things that I love to share about the King James Bible that I think is just eye-opening to most people is when we read in the King James and we hit those words that end in TH, right? Not the those and thous, but the cometh, goeth, giveth, all of these, right? That TH was never intended to be enunciated. it was a cue to the reader that it was an ongoing action, right? So the next time you're reading in a King James Bible, if you can get past the thous and the these and get to those words, see that and understand that as an ongoing action. It just opens up a whole new world of what Christ was saying to people. You know, he says, cometh, come, keep coming, come, right? Give, keep giving, you know. It's really interesting, and that's part of what we can't get across from the Hebrew language to English, is we don't have a tense that says this is an ongoing action. So they had some little cues like that in reading. It drives the Shakespeare people nuts because they love to enunciate those. And you tell them you're not supposed to, and they're like, what? So anyways, I'm going to stop there. Does anybody have any questions or anything? Yes?
So with the TH, how would you pronounce it?
Hold on.
How would you say cometh
Come?
without enunciating? Just come?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's a cue to the reader that it's an ongoing action, right? I suppose you could read it with the TH if that helped you understand that it's an ongoing action, but yeah, it wasn't intended to. Just one second, he's going to grab the mic here for you. They're streaming and recording these, so it's better to have you on a mic so they can hear it.
Go back there.
No, he's coming right here.
What about the so many other translations other than the King James? I love the King James. To me, it has a poetic nature about it. But
It does.
I also often will read out of the New King James. Is there a lot of difference in the translations, do you believe?
Well, I'm going to go back to my standby description. You guys didn't hear this before. Brother Tom's heard this about 10 times now, so I'm going to say it again. My mom was an art teacher. I grew up in a middle-class family. I'm kidding. No, my mother was an art teacher, and when I was a kid, I always loved Claude Monet. I loved his paintings. And when she would travel, she would bring me postcards and calendars of his paintings, and I thought they were wonderful. When I was in the military and I went to Desert Shield, I was stationed in England, and I went down to their National Gallery. I saw a collection of Monets for the first time, and the colors were so vibrant. It was incredible, right? To me, the biblical languages are that original Claude Monet, right? When we get to the King James, we're doing more of that postcard calendar version that's almost more of a watercolor. It's much more subdued, right? And then when we get to others that are more the ASV and ESV and those, I think we're getting to more of a black and white picture. It's still the same image, right? But you're losing and losing and losing as we move forward. So I don't have any particular axe to grind with one over another. The important thing is that we're reading in the scriptures, but I always encourage people to read it in one that you understand that you have, and then read it over here in the King James and start expanding your knowledge and your vocabulary to pick that up and grow in that. And then if you get to the point where that's no longer satisfying and you want more, well, then start moving to the interlinear and start looking at the original languages and things and keep growing. We're never supposed to stop growing in our Father, right? So, yeah. Does that help? Anybody else? No? Okay. Well, I thank you all for coming out this evening. Appreciate your being here. We do have a book at the back there that is the museum in book form, if that interests you. There is a list back there that if we do a newsletter. This is the first group. The last group, and I'm finally saying this, I'm remembering, we have a list back there for a newsletter that we do. And I only do it quarterly right now. Someday, I've been saying that for 10 years. Someday we're going to get up to doing it bi-monthly and monthly. But I write an article in each one Obviously, it tells where we're going, what we're doing, all these types of things. But then there's an article in each one of something significant in the biblical, archaeological, historical realm that's significant to us, right? And so if that interests you, you can give us your name and email on that. And if you'd like to support us, of course, there's ways to support us back there as well. Okay. Thank you.
We greatly appreciate your taking the time to come here to our little cattle town of Ava. We're surrounded by cattle 3-1. So if they ever get smart, we're really in trouble. But we're really thankful to bring a high quality exhibit to the people. I mean, that's like our Savior. He didn't just sit in one spot and everybody come to him. He went to the people, and so to hold up the word and the standard of the scriptures and go to the people is very valuable. And all of us out here in Cowtown, USA, we appreciate it.
I appreciate that. Now, I do have tons of cards back there too. So if you have family or friends in far-flung places or even nearby that would like to see this exhibit come to their area, all we need is an invitation. We don't charge to bring this out. We do all this just on donations. Nobody takes a paycheck out of this. We just do this to help.
And he
Enforce what we do.
actually doesn't care how big your congregation is.
That is true.
If it's just one person that needs to see the validity of Scripture, he's satisfied.
Yep.
Yep.
That is correct. All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.